The American Yawp. Chapter 5. Colonial Society. Section 1 Introduction. 18th century American culture moved in competing, and at times contradictory, directions. Even as commercial, military, and social ties between Great Britain and the North American colonies tightened, a new, distinctly American culture began to form, binding together colonists from New Hampshire to Georgia. Meanwhile, immigrants from other European nations alongside indigenous Americans and enslaved Africans created an increasingly diverse colonial population. All these different identities, women, men, and fluid people of all backgrounds, whether indigenous American, European, and African, led distinct lives within different communities and sovereignties. While life in the 13 colonies was shaped in part by European practices and participation in the larger Atlantic world, emerging cultural patterns increasingly transformed colonial North America into a society distinct from that of Great Britain. Section 2. Consumption and Trade in the British Atlantic. Transatlantic trade greatly enriched Britain, and it also created high standards of living for many North American colonists. This two-way relationship reinforced the colonial feeling of commonality with British culture. It was not until trade relations, disturbed by political changes and the demands of warfare, became strained in the 1760s that colonists began to question these ties. During the 17th and 18th centuries, developments in manufacturing, transportation, and the availability of credit increased the opportunity for colonists to purchase consumer goods. Instead of making their own tools, clothes, and utensils, colonists increasingly purchased luxury items made by specialized artisans and manufacturers. As the incomes of Americans rose and the prices of these commodities fell, these items shifted from luxuries to common goods. The average person's ability to spend money on consumer goods became a sign of their respectability. Historians have referred to this process as the, quote, consumer revolution. Britain relied on the colonies as a source of raw materials, such as lumber and tobacco. Both Anglo and indigenous Americans engaged with new forms of trade and financing that increased their ability to buy or utilize British-made goods. But the ways in which colonists paid for these goods varied sharply from those in Britain. When settlers first arrived in North America, they typically carried very little British money with them. Discovering no precious metals, and lacking the Crown's authority to mint coins, colonists relied on barter and non-traditional forms of exchange, including everything from nails to the wampum used by indigenous American polities in the Northeast. To deal with the lack of currency, many colonies resorted to commodity money, which varied from place to place. In Virginia, for example, the colonial legislature stipulated a rate of exchange for tobacco, standardizing it as a form of money in the colony. Commodities could be cumbersome and difficult to transport, so a system of notes developed. These notes allowed individuals to deposit a certain amount of tobacco in a warehouse and receive a note bearing the value of the deposit that could be traded as money. In 1690, colonial Massachusetts became the first place in the Western Hemisphere to issue paper bills to be used as money. These notes, called bills of credit, were issued for finite periods of time on the colony's credit and varied in denomination. While this system of notes provided colonists with a much-needed medium for exchange, it was not without its problems. Currency that worked in Virginia might be worthless in Pennsylvania. Colonists and officials in Britain debated whether it was right or desirable to use mere paper, as opposed to gold or silver, as a medium of exchange. Paper money tended to lose value quicker than coins, and was often counterfeited. These problems, as well as British merchants' reluctance to accept depreciated paper notes, caused the Board of Trade to restrict the usage of paper money in the Currency Acts of 1751 and 1763. Paper money was not the only medium of exchange, however. Colonists also used metal coins. Barter and the extension of credit, which could take the form of bills of exchange, akin to modern-day personal checks, remained important forces throughout the colonial period. Still, trade between colonies was greatly hampered by the lack of standardized money. Businesses on both sides of the Atlantic advertised both their goods and promises of obtaining credit. The consistent availability of credit allowed families of modest means to buy consumer items previously available only to elites. Cheap consumption allowed middle-class Americans to match many of the trends in clothing, food, and household decor that traditionally marked the wealthiest aristocratic classes. Anglo-Americans, often seen by their London peers as provincial or less cultivated, could present themselves as lords and ladies of their own communities by purchasing and displaying British-made goods. Visiting the home of a successful businessman in Boston, John Adams described, quote, "The furniture, which alone cost £1,000 sterling. A seat it is for a noble man, a prince, the Turkey carpets, the painted hangings, the marble table, the rich beds with crimson damask curtains and counterpins, the beautiful chimney clock, the spacious garden, are the most magnificent of anything I have seen." But many worried about the consequences of rising consumerism. A writer for the Boston Evening Post remarked on this new practice of purchasing status. For 'tis well known how credit is a mighty inducement with many people to purchase this and the other thing which they may well enough do without. Colonial Americans became more likely to find themselves in debt, whether to their local shopkeeper or a prominent London merchant, creating new feelings of dependence. Of course, the 13 continental colonies were not the only British colonies in the Western Hemisphere. In fact, they were considerably less important to the Crown than the sugar-producing islands of the Caribbean, including Jamaica, Barbados, the Leeward Islands, Grenada, St. Vincent, and Dominica. These British colonies were also inextricably connected to the continental colonies. Caribbean plantations dedicated nearly all of their land to the wildly profitable crop of sugarcane, so North American colonies sold surplus food and raw materials to these wealthy island colonies. Lumber was in high demand, especially in Barbados, where planters nearly deforested the island to make room for sugar plantations. To compensate for a lack of lumber, Barbadian colonists ordered house frames from New England. These prefabricated frames were sent via ships from which planters transported them to their plantations. Caribbean colonists also relied on the continental colonies for livestock, purchasing cattle and horses. The most lucrative exchange of all was the slave trade, with disastrous consequences. Connections between the Caribbean and North America brought commercial benefits to both regions. Those living on the continent relied on the Caribbean colonists to satisfy their craving for sugar and other goods like mahogany. British colonists in the Caribbean began cultivating sugar in the 1640s, and sugar took the Atlantic world by storm. In fact, by 1680, sugar exports from the tiny island of Barbados were valued more than the total exports of all the continental colonies. Jamaica, acquired by the Crown in 1655, surpassed Barbados in sugar production toward the end of the 17th century. North American colonists, like Britons around the world, craved sugar to sweeten their tea and food. Colonial elites also sought to decorate their parlors and dining rooms with the silky, polished surfaces of rare mahogany as opposed to local wood. While the bulk of this in-demand material went to Britain and Europe, New England merchants imported the wood from the Caribbean, where it was then transformed into exquisite furniture for those who could afford it. Women were integral to trade and consumption in 18th century cities. Many were active in the marketplace, managing stalls, trading goods, utilizing credit, and placing advertisements for goods. For example, tavern owner Abigail Stoneman enticed guests by offering billiards tables, and she regularly bought and sold merchandise from Atlantic merchants, many of whom she boards. Stoneman was an exceptionally successful businessperson, but women with smaller businesses also employed similar tactics. Trade with indigenous people also enriched the empire. Indigenous people consumed European guns, alcohol, kettles, knives, woolen blankets, and other everyday items. Europeans, in turn, purchased furs, deer hides, handicrafts, copper, and food. By the 1750s, the horse trade fundamentally changed trade patterns among many indigenous people, especially in the West, and allowed some tribal nations to subjugate those with fewer animals. For example, the Ute and Comanche alliance regularly raided Navajo, Pawnee, and Jicarilla Apache in Arizona and New Mexico. The horse also increased the gap between men's and women's work, and, in the case of the Ochitisacoan, altered the lifestyle of its people from a matrilineal to a patrilineal society. These systems of trade all existed with the purpose of enriching Great Britain. To ensure that profits ended up in Britain, Parliament imposed taxes on trade under the Navigation Acts. These taxes intertwined consumption with politics. Prior to 1763, Britain found that enforcing the regulatory laws they passed was difficult, and often cost them more than the duty revenue they would bring in. As a result, colonists found it relatively easy to violate the law and trade with foreign nations, pirates, or smugglers. Customs officials were bribed easily, and it was not uncommon to see Dutch, French, or West Indies ships laden with prohibited goods in American ports. When smugglers were caught, their American peers often acquitted them. British officials estimated that nearly 700,000 pounds worth of illicit goods was brought into the American colonies annually. Pirates also helped to perpetuate the illegal trading activities by providing a buffer between merchants and foreign ships. Beginning with the Sugar Act in 1764 and continuing with the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, Parliament levied taxes on sugar, paper, lead, glass, and tea, all products that contributed to colonists' sense of gentility. In response, colonists organized non-importation agreements and reverted to domestic products. Homespun cloth became a political statement by women such as the Daughters of Liberty, as they boycotted British-made goods. A writer in the Essex Gazette in 1769 proclaimed, "I presume there never was a time when, or a place where, the spinning wheel could more influence the affairs of men than at present." The consumer revolution fueled the growth of colonial cities. Cities in colonial America were crossroads for the movement of people and goods, and 1 in 20 colonists lived in cities by 1775. Some cities grew organically over time, while others were planned from the start. New York's and Boston's 17th century street plans reflected the haphazard arrangement of medieval cities in Europe. In other cities like Philadelphia and Charleston, civic leaders laid out urban plans according to calculated systems of regular blocks and squares. Planners in Annapolis and Williamsburg also imposed regularity and order over their city streets through the placement of government, civic, and educational buildings. By 1775, Boston, Newport, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston were the 5 largest cities in British North America. Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and Charleston had populations of approximately 40,000, 25,000, 16,000, and 12,000 people, respectively. Urban society was highly stratified. At the base of the social ladder were the laboring classes, which included both enslaved and free people ranging from apprentices to master craftsmen. While the legal status and rights of enslaved people were more flexible in the 17th and early 18th centuries than after the establishment of the United States, their position was always more vulnerable than that of free working people. Next came the middling sort: shopkeepers, artisans, and skilled mariners. Above them stood the merchant elites, who tended to be actively involved in the city's social and political affairs, as well as in the buying, selling, and trading of goods. Enslaved men and women had a visible presence in both northern and southern cities. Many enslaved people lived in rural areas and performed agricultural labor, but not exclusively so. In port cities, enslaved laborers often worked as domestic servants and in skilled trades: distilleries, shipyards, lumber yards, and rope walks. Between 1725 and 1775, slavery became increasingly significant in the northern colonies as urban residents sought greater participation in the maritime economy. Massachusetts was the first slaveholding colony in New England. New York traced its connections to slavery and the slave trade back to the Dutch settlers of New Netherland in the 17th century. Philadelphia also became an active site of the Atlantic slave trade, and enslaved people accounted for nearly 8% of the city's population in 1770. In southern cities, including Charleston, urban slavery played an important role in the market economy. Enslaved people, both rural and urban, made up the majority of the working population on the eve of the American Revolution.